The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the dull ache that pulsed through Isabella's body. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the harsh light above her. The world seemed like a blur, a kaleidoscope of disjointed images, jagged and distant. The familiar hum of machines echoed in the background, a reminder of the accident that had shattered her body and, unknowingly, her entire life. It took several moments before the truth began to seep in. She wasn't in the comfort of her room at the family estate. She wasn't surrounded by the bustling sounds of servants and the soothing, ornate decor her father had insisted upon to hide their family's crumbling empire. No, this was a hospital, cold, unfeeling, and far from the safety of her former world. Her mother's letters, tucked away in a drawer she hadn't touched in years, began to drift back to her thoughts, as if her spirit had left behind a trail of wisdom for her to follow. But there was no time for memories, not now. Not when Veronica's cold gaze had been the last thing she remembered before everything went dark. She hadn't known it then, but the car crash was no accident. The brakes had been cut, and Veronica had orchestrated it all. As the haze began to lift from her mind, Isabella's fingers curled into the sheets, her heart racing. She couldn't remember exactly how long she'd been unconscious, but in the days before the crash, there had been whispers, faint murmurs that her father's financial ruin was a secret Veronica and Richard had hidden from her. "What is it, Veronica?" she'd asked, just days before the accident. "What have you done with the company?" The answer had been a cruel smile. "Your father's legacy is no longer your concern, Isabella. You're nothing but a pawn in this game." The words now burned in her memory, sharp and clear. Isabella turned her head to the side, catching a glimpse of the window. The world outside seemed untouched by the chaos that had consumed her life. How could everything still seem so normal? She had been shattered, left to die at the hands of her own family, and yet here she was alive. Her gaze dropped to the drip in her arm, the line connected to her veins like an umbilical cord feeding her back into this world of lies. No more. She wasn't the helpless, naive daughter of a rich magnate anymore. She wasn't going to allow herself to be manipulated, to be sidelined by her stepmother's ambitions. She would uncover the truth, no matter how dark or twisted it was. The road to revenge would not be easy, but she had already been broken. What more could they do to her? Isabella inhaled sharply, her body protesting as she shifted, and with a determination born from the wreckage of her former self, she vowed to take back everything her family had stolen from her, starting with the truth. Days passed before Isabella was allowed to leave the sterile confines of the hospital room. The physical pain was excruciating, but it was the emptiness in her heart that threatened to swallow her whole. She was alone. Her father, once her protector, hadn't even visited. He hadn't cared enough to stand by her side. Veronica had, of course, but only to ensure that Isabella remained silent. Her stepmother had been the one to orchestrate the accident. Isabella was sure of it. Veronica's cold, calculating eyes had been the last thing she saw before the world turned black. She planned this, and Isabella knew she wasn't going to let Veronica get away with it. But how? What could she do? She'd been locked away in a gilded cage for most of her life, never exposed to the true extent of her father's empire. She had always thought herself the heiress to a great fortune, the rightful inheritor of the business her father had built. How could she have been so blind? Her fingers trembled as she reached for the stack of letters her mother had written before she passed. She hadn't opened them in years, but now they seemed like the only remnants of a world where she wasn't trapped in a spider's web of lies. Her mother had always been the voice of reason, the one person who had seen through the cracks in her father's empire. But what had she left behind? Isabella opened the top letter, and the words that her mother had written hit her like a wave. "The company is built on a foundation of lies. Your father's empire is not the legacy you think it is, my dear. The wealth he has accumulated is soaked in blood, manipulations, betrayals, deals made in the shadows. You must be prepared for what comes next, for there is a storm brewing in the depths of this house." The letter continued with more cryptic warnings, but Isabella's mind was reeling. Her mother had known, and she had tried to protect her from the truth. But now that truth was her reality. She sat back, trying to process what she had just read. She was no longer just the daughter of a powerful magnate. She was now the keeper of a dark secret. Her father had built his empire on shady dealings, all hidden behind the facade of respectability. But Isabella would no longer allow herself to be complicit in the lies. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. "Miss Isabella," came a voice from the hallway. It was one of the house staff. "There's someone here to see you." Isabella straightened up in her bed, still weak but determined to regain control. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "A man named Xavier Delacroix," the staff member replied. "He says it's urgent." Xavier Delacroix. The name sent a shiver down her spine. She had heard of him, an enigmatic businessman, ruthless in his dealings, a man who thrived in the shadows. He was a force to be reckoned with, someone who knew how to make things happen. "Let him in," Isabella said, her voice cold with resolve. When Xavier entered, she couldn't help but notice how effortlessly powerful he appeared. His tailored suit seemed to swallow the room, his presence filling the space with a silent intensity. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Isabella wondered if he could see through her, the anger, the betrayal, the pain. "You've been through quite an ordeal," he said, his voice smooth but laced with an underlying coldness. Isabella's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she replied. "What brings you here, Mr. Delacroix?" He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I know what happened to you," he said simply, "and I know about your family's business. Your father's company is on the verge of collapsing, and Veronica is playing her game with Richard. But you—" He paused, studying her with a sharp, calculating gaze. "You're more than just a victim, Isabella. You got the mind for strategy, and that's why I'm here." She raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "You want to make a deal?" Xavier leaned forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "I want to help you take down your family's empire, destroy Veronica, and Richard's hold on it. But I don't do charity, Isabella. If you want my help, you'll have to play the game. And trust me, it's a game you're going to have to learn how to play if you want to win." Isabella took a deep breath. She was already in the midst of a war, and Xavier seemed to be offering her the tools to fight back. But could she trust him? "Why help me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the weight of the question. "What's in this for you?" Xavier's lips curled into a knowing smile. "We all have our reasons, Miss Isabella. Mine just happened to align with yours." He stood ready to leave. "Think about it. We can destroy your stepmother and brother together. But only if you're willing to do whatever it takes." As he turned to leave, Isabella couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She was about to embark on a dangerous path, one that would require more than just revenge. It would require cunning, manipulation, and a ruthlessness she wasn't sure she possessed. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. She would never let her family's treachery go unpunished. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, research, and planning. Xavier's presence lingered in Isabella's life like a shadow, ever present, a reminder of the deal she had made. But with each passing day, she found herself becoming more attuned to the game he had promised her. Together, they began to unravel the threads of her family's empire. Veronica's manipulation of her father's assets, Richard's secret dealings with competitors. The family business was nothing more than a house of cards, and Xavier had shown her how to topple it piece by piece. Isabella had always prided herself on her intellect, but the depth of her family's deceit had stunned her. Her father had built his wealth on lies, on backdoor deals, and Isabella now saw how Veronica had used every opportunity to strengthen her own grip on the business, while keeping Isabella sidelined. But now, Isabella had a different kind of power. She had knowledge that could bring the entire empire to its knees. The pieces were falling into place, and the game was about to begin. The story will continue to follow Isabella's gradual transformation from a sheltered girl into a sharp, calculating woman who uses her intellect and cunning to take down her family's empire. Her alliance with Xavier will grow more complex, and she will be forced to confront her own emotions as the cost of revenge becomes clearer. Along the way, she will face obstacles, including betrayal, personal conflict, and the shadow of her family's legacy, all while trying to navigate a path that will ultimately lead her to her own redemption or destruction. As the days turned into weeks, Isabella grew more accustomed to the shadowed life she now led, a life in which she was no longer the innocent heiress, but a player in a game of manipulation, power and revenge. Xavier Delacroix had become an unexpected but necessary presence in her life. His ruthlessness was almost comforting, the way he spoke with certainty, knowing exactly how to navigate the labyrinth of corporate treachery. But Isabella's mind was always one step ahead. She understood the game Xavier was teaching her, and while he had helped her understand the mechanics of manipulation and corporate sabotage, she was learning to play the game in her own way. Her motives were personal, deeply personal, and that made her dangerous. She was no longer the fragile daughter of a magnate, a pawn to be used. She had learned to wield power, and soon her stepmother Veronica would realize just how dangerous a woman scorned could be. Late one evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with Xavier, Isabella stood in front of the full-length mirror in her study, her reflection a reminder of the woman she had become. The girl who had once dreamed of a perfect life, a life of luxury and security, was gone. In her place was a woman with a fire in her eyes, the same fire that had burned in her mother's letters. The door to her study opened, and a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Isabella," came the soft voice of her butler, Henry. "A letter arrived for you. It's marked with your father's seal." Isabella turned, her curiosity piqued. Her father's seal, the same seal that had once symbolized strength and authority, now felt like a cruel mockery. She took the letter from Henry, breaking the seal with a practiced motion. The letter inside was brief, the handwriting unfamiliar. "Isabella, I know what you're trying to do, but you must stop. I have already made arrangements for your safety. Do not make the same mistakes I did. Veronica and Richard are not what they seem, and you will only destroy yourself if you continue down this path. Come to the estate immediately. We need to talk. Your father—" The words were stark, urgent. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't seen her father in months, and now he was asking her to come back to the estate, back to the heart of the family's empire. But she wasn't the same naive girl who had once adored her father. She knew better now. The letter had been written in haste, but the tone was unmistakable. Her father was afraid of something, perhaps of what she was about to do. He wasn't as untouchable as she had once believed. Isabella folded the letter with care, her resolve hardening. It was time to confront the man who had failed her in every way, the man who had allowed her to be pawned off in this game of power. She would go to the estate, but not to listen to his pleas. She would go to finish what she had started. The drive to the estate was long, and every mile Isabella traveled felt like a step back into a life she had outgrown. She looked out the window of the sleek black car, the lights of the city fading into the distance, replaced by the sprawling grounds of her family's estate. The house loomed ahead, its stone façade as cold and imposing as she remembered. It was a house built on lies, its grand halls and luxurious rooms hiding the rot within. When the car came to a stop in front of the mansion, Isabella felt a strange sense of detachment. This was no longer home. This was a battleground. She stepped out of the car, the air cool against her skin. Henry, who had accompanied her, opened the front door, and Isabella walked inside, her heels clicking on the marble floors. The house felt empty, the echoes of her footsteps, all that remained of the life that had once been so vibrant. "Father!" she called, her voice resonating through the hall. A door at the end of the corridor creaked open, and her father stepped into view. He looked older, his once imposing figure now hunched, as though the weight of the world had settled upon his shoulders. His face softened when he saw her, but the wariness in his eyes was unmistakable. "Isabella," he said, his voice laced with regret. "I'm glad you came." Isabella didn't bother with pleasantries. "You wanted to talk," she said coldly. "So talk." He motioned for her to follow him into the study. The room was just as it had always been, wooden shelves filled with books, a large desk in the center, and the heavy scent of cigar smoke still lingering in the air. As they sat down, her father leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I never wanted you to get involved in this," he began. "Veronica, Richard, they've become obsessed with power. But you, Isabella, you've always been different. I wanted to protect you from all of this." Isabella's eyes narrowed. "Protect me?" she repeated. "By keeping me in the dark? By letting Veronica control everything while you watched?" Her father flinched, but he didn't deny it. "I thought I could shield you from the worst of it, but it's too late now. The company is built on lies. Isabella cut him off. You let it fall apart, piece by piece, and Veronica and Richard have been pulling the strings the whole time. He shook his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. It's more complicated than you think. You don't know what Veronica is capable of, what she's been doing behind the scenes. Isabella stood up, her chair scraping across the floor. I don't need your warnings, father, she said, her voice steady but hard. I've already seen enough. I know exactly what I need to do. Her father's face twisted in fear. Please, Isabella, don't make the same mistakes I did. If you go down this path, you'll lose everything. Isabella paused, her gaze fixed on him. I've already lost everything, she said softly. And I've gained something in return. A will to survive. You never gave me that. But I'll find it myself. She turned and walked out of the study, her heart heavy but her mind clear. This was no longer about her father. This was about her, about reclaiming the life that had been stolen from her, no matter the cost. As Isabella left the estate, she felt the weight of her decision settle over her. There was no going back. Her alliance with Xavier was the first step, but it wouldn't be the last. Veronica and Richard had made their move, and now it was time for her to make hers. But she knew the road ahead would be treacherous. Every step would be calculated, every move scrutinized. And in the shadows, Xavier's presence loomed, both an ally and a threat. The game was just beginning, and Isabella had no intention of losing. The morning after Isabella's confrontation with her father, the weight of what she had done settled into her bones. The estate was no longer a place of refuge or childhood memories. It was a battlefield, and every room she stepped into felt like a reminder of what was at stake. Her father's pleas still echoed in her ears, but they were no longer enough to sway her resolve. She had made her decision. There was no turning back. Xavier's words lingered in her thoughts. The game is only just beginning, Isabella. And he was right. Her next move would set everything in motion. She arrived at the headquarters of her father's company, the building towering above her like a symbol of the empire she intended to tear down. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The staff, once deferential and loyal, now whispered behind closed doors. They had heard the rumors of her father's failing health, of his dwindling power, and the growing influence of Veronica and Richard. Isabella could feel the eyes of the employees on her as she passed by, but she remained impassive, her focus unwavering. Her office, which had once been a sanctuary, now felt like a war room. She sat at the desk, her hands resting on the cool surface, and she began to make her first strategic move. The financial records, once hidden away from her, were now at her fingertips. The deals, the backroom agreements, the shoddy business practices, it was all there, plain and undeniable. Her father's empire had been built on shaky ground, and Veronica had done everything in her power to ensure it would stay that way. She had allowed Isabella to remain ignorant of the truth, to think that everything was under control. But now Isabella knew the truth, and it made her sick. The phone on her desk rang, and her heart skipped a beat. It was Xavier. Isabella, he said, his voice smooth as always. I assume you've seen the numbers. The company is a sinking ship, and Veronica knows it. But she's not going to go down without a fight. She's already making her move. We need to act fast. Isabella's grip on the phone tightened. I know what needs to be done, she replied, her voice cold. We'll take her down piece by piece. I'll start with her financials. There's always something to be found when you look deep enough. Good. But don't underestimate her, Xavier warned. She's been playing this game longer than you've realized. She knows how to hide her tracks. If you're going to win this, you need to think like her. Isabella hung up the phone and sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Xavier was right. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Every move had to be calculated, every step planned. She wasn't just playing against Veronica and Richard anymore. She was playing against the very fabric of her family's empire. That evening, as Isabella sifted through the stacks of financial documents, she was struck by a memory. It was of her mother, her strong, determined mother, who had always spoken of loyalty, of integrity. Her mother had known something about the company, something that had troubled her, but Isabella had never paid much attention to it as a child. Now, with the pieces falling into place, she understood. Her mother had left her more than just letters. She had left her a legacy of defiance against the lies that had built the family fortune. It was a legacy Isabella could no longer ignore. But there was something else, something darker. As she pored over the documents, she found an account, one that had never been discussed in the family. It was a series of transactions, all linked to a name she didn't recognize. The name was simple, V. Dillard, but the amount of money flowing in and out of the account was staggering. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? A search of the records revealed that V. Dillard was an alias. Veronica. Isabella's fingers trembled as she read further. The account had been used to funnel money into a series of fake shell companies, all linked to offshore accounts. It was a scheme, one that her stepmother had been orchestrating behind her back for years. The amounts were so large, so carefully hidden, that it was almost impossible to trace. But Isabella had found the thread. She would pull at it, piece by piece, until the entire web of lies unraveled. The next morning, Isabella called a meeting with the board of directors. They had all been loyal to her father, but their loyalty was rooted in power, not family. They had served him because he had been a strong, respected figure in the business world. But now, with her father in decline and the company teetering on the edge of collapse, their loyalty was as fragile as glass. As she entered the conference room, the murmurs quieted and all eyes turned to her. They had seen the headlines, rumors of her father's health, whispers of her stepmother's growing influence. They knew something was coming, but none of them had expected Isabella. "I've reviewed the company's books," she began, her voice calm and authoritative. "And I'm sure you all have as well. We all know the company is failing, but what you don't know is why. Veronica and Richard have been making deals in the shadows, siphoning funds from the company to line their pockets." A collective gasp swept through the room. Isabella could see the doubt in their eyes, the disbelief that one of their own could be involved in such corruption. But she wasn't finished. "I have proof," she continued, laying the documents out on the table for them to see. "These are the accounts, the transactions that prove Veronica has been hiding money, creating fake companies to move it around. She's been playing all of you." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, one of the senior executives, a man Isabella had known since childhood, spoke up. This is a serious accusation, Isabella," he said, his voice wavering. "You need more than just documents." Isabella stood tall, her gaze unwavering. "I have more than just documents," she said, her tone ice cold. "I have the truth." She turned to the rest of the board. "If you want to keep your jobs, if you want to protect your own interests, you'll help me bring this company back to its rightful owner. And that owner is me." That evening, Isabella met with Xavier. The move she had made with the board was bold, but it had only been the first step. She had to make Veronica and Richard believe they were still in control. The more they thought they had the upper hand, the more vulnerable they would be when the final blow came. Xavier was pleased with her progress. "You've done well," he said, a rare hint of approval in his voice. "But you know this isn't over. Veronica will fight back, and she'll use everything at her disposal." "I'm ready," Isabella replied, her eyes steely with determination. "I've learned from the best, and I won't stop until I have everything she's taken from me." Xavier's gaze softened for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. "Just remember, Isabella," he said, his voice quiet. "Revenge comes at a cost." "I understand," she said, her mind already on the next move. "But I've already paid the price." The tension in the air grew thicker as Isabella set the next phase of her plan in motion. The company's board members had been shaken by the revelations she had presented, but Veronica and Richard weren't going to back down easily. They would have their defenses, their own counterattacks, and Isabella would have to be ready for every single one of them. She spent the next few days strategizing, deep in the maze of legal documents, financial records, and power plays. Xavier had warned her that Veronica would go to any length to protect her empire, but Isabella was determined to prove that she was more than just a victim. She was a force to be reckoned with. At the same time, her emotions were becoming more and more entangled in this war. There was a coldness in her heart now, a part of her that had been carved away by the years of manipulation and betrayal. But in the quiet moments, when she allowed herself to remember who she once was, she felt the sting of everything she had lost. The life she had once dreamed of had been shattered, and in its place, there was only the cold steel of vengeance. And yet, a part of her wondered if revenge was really what she wanted anymore. But those thoughts were fleeting, drowned out by the noise of the game. The corporate wars she was fighting required focus and precision, and in this game, there was no room for doubt. The tension in the air grew thicker as Isabella set the next phase of her plan in motion. The company's board members had been shaken by the revelations she had presented, but Veronica and Richard weren't going to back down easily. They would have their defenses, their own counterattacks, and Isabella would have to be ready for every single one of them. She spent the next few days strategizing, deep in the maze of legal documents, financial records, and power plays. Xavier had warned her that Veronica would go to any length to protect her empire, but Isabella was determined to prove that she was more than just a victim. She was a force to be reckoned with. At the same time, her emotions were becoming more and more entangled in this war. There was a coldness in her heart now, a part of her that had been carved away by the years of manipulation and betrayal. But in the quiet moments, when she allowed herself to remember who she once was, she felt the sting of everything she had lost. The life she had once dreamed of had been shattered, and in its place, there was only the cold steel of vengeance. And yet, a part of her wondered if revenge was really what she wanted anymore. But those thoughts were fleeting, drowned out by the noise of the game. The corporate wars she was fighting required focus and precision, and in this game, there was no room for doubt. Isabella sat in her office late one evening, the glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, her city now, she reminded herself. The skyline shimmered under the weight of the full moon, a stark contrast to the darkness that threatened to swallow her family's legacy. Xavier had been the one to suggest the first move, a strategic buyout of one of Veronica's most trusted allies. It was a calculated strike, a way to undermine her power by dismantling the network of support that had kept her afloat. With this buyout, Veronica would lose more than just a business partner. She would lose a significant portion of her influence over the board. Isabella pressed a button on her desk, summoning Henry, her loyal butler, into the room. "Arrange the meeting with the buyer," she ordered, her voice cold. "We need to act swiftly. Veronica will be watching. We can't afford to give her time to retaliate." Henry nodded. "Of course, Miss Isabella." As he left to make the arrangements, Isabella sat back, her mind running through the countless steps that would follow this move. The buyout was only the beginning. She needed to ensure that every player in the game understood that she was no longer just the naive daughter of a dying magnate. She was a leader, a force. The thought gave her a bitter sense of satisfaction. It didn't take long for Veronica to respond. The moment news of the buyout hit the board, Veronica's reaction was swift and brutal. Isabella could practically feel her stepmother's fury radiating from the phone call that came early the next morning. "You think you can just take what's mine, Isabella?" Veronica's voice hissed through the line. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. I've built this empire from the ground up, and I'll burn it to the ground before I let you take it." Isabella leaned back in her chair, unfazed. "I don't need to take what's yours, Veronica. It's already mine. The empire was built on lies, and I'm here to expose them, piece by piece." Veronica's laugh was a harsh, cruel sound. "You think you're a player in this game? You're just a little girl pretending to be a woman, and I'll make sure you regret it." Isabella's fingers tightened around the phone, her expression hardening. "We'll see about that." She ended the call with a quiet click, her mind already working on her next move. Veronica might be angry, but it was clear that her stepmother underestimated her, and that would be her downfall. Days passed, and the battle between Isabella and Veronica became more intense. The boardroom was a war zone, filled with backstabbing and corporate maneuvering. But Isabella was no longer playing catch-up. She had learned the art of manipulation well, and she had more than a few tricks up her sleeve. One of the most devastating moves she made was revealing the hidden financial transactions between Veronica and Richard, transactions that, if exposed, would leave them both vulnerable to legal action. She had Xavier's connections, and with one well-placed call, the threat of scandal was enough to force Veronica into a corner. But Veronica wasn't going to give up easily. As Isabella would soon discover, her stepmother had secrets of her own, dark, dangerous secrets that could destroy them both. One evening, as Isabella was preparing for another round of legal meetings, she received an unexpected visitor. It was Henry, his face pale with urgency. "Miss Isabella, there's something you need to see," he said, handing her an envelope sealed with wax. Isabella tore it open, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. Her heart skipped a beat as she read through the letter. It was a warning, an ultimatum from Veronica, threatening to expose Isabella's own hidden past if she didn't back off. The letter was filled with details about Isabella's mother's death, the circumstances surrounding it, and how her father had covered it up. Veronica knew the truth about everything. She had always known. Isabella's mind raced as she processed the information. Veronica had been holding this card, waiting for the right moment to play it. And now, it seemed, that moment had arrived. The following night, Isabella couldn't sleep. The letter Veronica had sent weighed heavily on her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her entire world was crumbling around her. She had always known that her family's secrets were dangerous, but she hadn't anticipated just how far Veronica would go to keep them buried. As she stared out the window, her reflection blending with the city lights, she thought about her mother. The mother who had tried to protect her from this very world. Isabella had never fully understood her mother's warnings until now. Was this what her mother had feared? That one day, Isabella would find herself caught between a web of lies, torn between revenge and the truth? Isabella stood up, determination coursing through her veins. Veronica had played her hand, but it wasn't over. This game was far from finished. The stakes had never been higher. Veronica had threatened to expose Isabella's past, but Isabella wasn't about to back down. She would confront the truth, but on her terms. And in doing so, she would make sure that she emerged victorious. The final confrontation would be one of power, truth, and the unraveling of everything Veronica had worked so hard to protect. Isabella would no longer be the naive daughter of a magnate. She would be the woman who reclaimed everything, her family's legacy, her future, and her place in the world. As the pieces fell into place, Isabella knew one thing for certain: she had become the true heir to her father's empire. And no one, least of all Veronica, could take that away from her. The following days felt like an intense game of chess, each move calculated with precision, every piece a vital part of her strategy. Veronica had made her move, revealing secrets about Isabella's mother's death. But Isabella wasn't shaken by the threat. In fact, it only solidified her resolve to confront the shadows of her past. She had lived her life trying to keep her mother's death in the back of her mind, burying the painful memories of a tragic accident. But now, it seemed, the truth could no longer be ignored. Isabella sat in her office, her mind racing. It wasn't just Veronica's threats that kept her awake at night. It was the weight of the past. She needed answers, and there was one place she could find them: her father's private study. As she made her way through the estate, Isabella felt the familiar chill of the marble floors beneath her feet. The study was at the far end of the house, tucked away in a quiet corner, a place where her father had spent countless hours buried in his work. It had always been off limits to her, but tonight it was her only option. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside. The room was filled with the scent of leather-bound books, aged paper, and a faint trace of tobacco. It was a space that felt both familiar and foreign, a place where her father had built his empire and where his secrets had been hidden. Her eyes scanned the shelves, and then they fell upon a desk, the surface cluttered with papers. Among the piles, she noticed something that stood out: an old, yellowing envelope sealed with wax. Her heart skipped as she recognized the crest. It was her mother's handwriting. Isabella carefully opened the letter, her fingers trembling as she read the words. The letter was addressed to her father, and it detailed her mother's suspicions about the accident. She had always believed it was just that, an accident, but her mother had feared otherwise. Isabella's mother had known something about her father's dealings, about Veronica's ambitions, and about the truth of what had happened that fateful night. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a letter, it was a confession. Her mother had suspected foul play in the accident, believing that someone had orchestrated it to remove her from the picture. She had wanted to confront the truth before it was too late, but she never had the chance. Tears welled in Isabella's eyes as she clutched the letter to her chest. The truth had always been so close, yet so out of reach. But now she had it. She had the power to expose everything. The time had come. Isabella knew that if she was going to take down Veronica and Richard, she had to confront them with the truth. She wasn't just playing for the company anymore. She was playing for her mother's memory, and for the future she was determined to claim. The board meeting was set, and Isabella was prepared to make her final move. She had gathered every shred of evidence she needed, the financial records, the hidden accounts, the letter from her mother. She had Xavier's backing, and the board members, though still divided, were starting to realize that she was the one with the power to save the company from the chaos her stepmother had created. As the boardroom filled with the usual suspects, Isabella walked in, her presence commanding attention. The whispers stopped, and every eye in the room turned to her. Veronica sat at the head of the table, her icy gaze fixed on Isabella. Richard, too, looked uneasy, his posture stiff as he avoided eye contact. "Let's get this over with," Veronica said coldly. "What more do you think you can accomplish, Isabella? You've made your move, but you're not in control." Isabella met her stepmother's gaze with unwavering determination. "I'm not here to play games anymore, Veronica," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here to expose the truth." With a deliberate motion, Isabella placed the documents on the table, pages of financial corruption, secret accounts, and the damning evidence that would destroy Veronica's empire. But it wasn't just about the company. It was about everything Veronica had taken from her. "And I'm not alone," Isabella continued, her voice rising with authority. "I have proof of everything. The illegal deals, the betrayals, the truth about my mother's death. You can try to bury it all you want, but it's coming to light. You've manipulated the board, you've destroyed everything in your path, and now you'll face the consequences." Veronica's eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing her face. She had thought she was untouchable, that her lies would never be exposed. But Isabella had outplayed her at every turn. "You think you can destroy me?" Veronica hissed, standing up from her seat. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Isabella. I will bury you, just like I buried your mother." The room went silent. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expression tense as the weight of the situation settled over him. It was clear now that Isabella wasn't just fighting for the company, she was fighting for her mother's memory, for the truth that had been hidden for so long. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Veronica," Isabella said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." The final moments of the meeting were a blur. Veronica attempted to rally the board, but the evidence was undeniable. One by one, the members turned against her, their loyalty shattered by the truth that Isabella had exposed. Even Richard, who had always stood by Veronica's side, found himself cornered. "Do you really want to continue supporting her?" Isabella asked him, her gaze sharp. "She's been using you. You're just a pawn in her game. And now, you're going to pay the price for it." Richard's face was pale, his eyes flicking to Veronica for reassurance. But there was no reassurance to be found. The weight of Isabella's revelations had shattered Veronica's carefully constructed world. In the end, Veronica was ousted from her position, and Richard, stripped of his influence, had no choice but to comply. The board had spoken, and Isabella had won. But the victory was bittersweet. As Isabella walked out of the boardroom, her heart was heavy with the knowledge of what she had lost. Her family, her mother, the life she had once known, all of it had been sacrificed on the altar of revenge. Yet, she had emerged victorious. The company was hers. Her mother's legacy was restored. And Veronica, once a towering figure of power, had been brought down. Isabella stood at the top of the stairs in the grand lobby of the company's headquarters, looking out over the city. The future was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure: it was hers to claim. Months passed, and Isabella continued to rebuild her father's empire. She worked tirelessly, making sure that every decision was made with integrity, every deal transparent. She had become the woman her mother had always hoped she would be: strong, unyielding, and determined to make things right. Xavier remained by her side, his loyalty unwavering. They had come a long way from the strategic alliance they had formed, but Isabella knew there was more to their relationship than just business. In him, she found a partner, someone who understood the weight of the world they carried on their shoulders. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Xavier approached her on the balcony of her penthouse office. "You've done it," he said softly, his voice filled with admiration. "You've rebuilt everything. You've taken back what was yours." Isabella looked out over the skyline, a sense of peace settling over her. "It's not just about taking it back," she said quietly. "It's about making sure it's worth something this time." Xavier stepped closer, his presence a steady comfort. "You've proven that you can survive anything. And now you can thrive." Isabella smiled, turning to face him. "We both can." The future was no longer a distant dream. It was within her reach. And this time, it was hers to shape. With Xavier by her side, Isabella was ready to embrace the new chapter of her life. One where power, truth, and redemption would guide her every step. The storm was over. The shadows had receded. And in the silence that followed, Isabella knew one thing. She had finally reclaimed her future.